Welcome to the business end. Today we're joined by someone who's spent 2 decades inside high-performance systems across 4 continents. Not as a theorist, but as a person responsible for making those systems actually hold together under pressure. Lúcás Ó'Ceallacháin is Irish. He started in rugby over a decade of development and high-performance work across Ireland, Kazakhstan and Russia. He moved into wrestling, spending 4 years as development director with the United World Wrestling Organization, where he built a global talent identification and scholarship program covering 114 athletes across multiple nations, with a 50% Olympic qualification rate for Rio 2016. He ran the wrestling competition at the 2018 Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast, then took over as high-performance director at Wrestling Canada LUT, where he led the program to a record-breaking 4-medal performance at the World Championship. He did that while also redesigning the culture of the organization from the inside, moving it from a compliance-based system to one built around psychological safety and shared standards. He built that program through COVID, through cancelled competitions, disrupted training environments, and an Olympic cycle that stopped making sense. After Canada, he moved to Australia to work with the Australian Institute of Sport, leading coach development for the Gen 32 program, responsible for shaping the next generation of Olympic and Paralympic coaches ahead of Brisbane 32. He's currently a performance coach with Hintsa Performance and has completed an MSc in skill acquisition and most recently led the artistic swimming program for Australia in 2024. Across all of it, he's operated in environments where the system, not the individual, determines whether performance is suitable or not. Lúcás, welcome to the business end.
Thanks a lot, Justin. My head's just grown massively after that very long and extensive intro. But yeah, thank you so much.
There was a lot to take in there. You've been on a hell of a journey.
Yeah, so I've been fortunate, I guess, to work across a number of systems and environments and also a range of sports as well. So yeah, it's a lot to fit in and to cover off, and maybe gives a bit more context to the type of work that I do today.
Very good.
Yeah. So, morning, Lucas, and thanks, Fitzy, for the introduction. That's why I gave it to you. And yeah, we have a common friend in Dr. Stephen McIver. So great that you're on our show. So let's dive into it straight away. So when you arrived at Wrestling Canada in 2018 as the interim high performance director, their previous high performance director resigned. So you walked into a system basically in midstream, preparation cycles, coaches already still in place, a culture set already. What was actually broken when you got there, and what was the first thing you had to decide before you could decide anything else?
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting time to arrive into that environment. The previous high performance director gone on gardening leave, essentially, but there was a lot of broken trust around coach-athlete relationships, a lot of things that had gone on that just, weren't appropriate. So they had a bit of the sword of Damocles kind of hanging over them in terms of funding and performance. And then, 4 training centers around the country that are trying to work together as Team Canada. I'd been approached by several people to say, come in and work with us. So when I arrived, I started to discover all these things that were going on. But essentially the challenge was you had 4 cultures within a culture. So you had 4 different centers with different coach and a different style, all trying to compete and represent Canada, but they were actually competing with each other. So the mentality was really around being the best in Canada, because, I want to knock off the guy from Montreal. I'm from Toronto, just as an example, instead of being the best in the world. So a lot of the work that we did early on was what's it going to take to be the best in the world, taking the opinions of the coaches, getting out and visiting them, talking to them about what their challenges were on the ground where they were, and then also bringing some evidence into that as well in terms of, checking some assumptions maybe that some people had, but also supporting them with what they needed. And a key thing with any new organization is always trying to find a way to get some early wins on the board. So what can we do to kind of build a bit of positive momentum? So what's something that, I don't really have to make a principle stand on and say, actually, yeah, you can have that, so that they feel like actually they're pretty engaged in it, and then bring them closer to kind of, okay, where's the common ground now where we need to work? So that was kind of how we started, but a lot of broken trust just between programs, a lot of animosity. There was a big report going on in the background that dug up like stuff that was quite old, but still quite painful for people to be going through. If you look at what we do today, even in our sport, in rugby, there's things that we just couldn't get away with that we used to do, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I remember one of the coaches giving me a bum tap as I went out onto the field. I never had one of those before, and I kind of did a double take. And now I know if you did that in certain environments, you'd be in a lot of trouble. So there's a lot of things that were, just not done well. And then there were things that just weren't appropriate as well. So it was about getting the balance between not losing sight of actually what makes us really good at what we do, but at the same time building a culture that's a bit more, forward facing and a bit more purpose fit for the future, if you like.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So firstly, when you got in there, the system was broken. What you started the system to break up, do you think?
Yeah, I think just like historical issues that had gone on, and then, coach athlete relationships just weren't good. So, there weren't clear policies on why people were getting picked and what they were getting picked for. There was a lot of misunderstanding around funding and how funding worked and, what you could get. And look, as an Olympic athlete, it's not glamorous. You don't make lots of money as an Olympian, even less than a rugby player, which again isn't a lot, but you're putting your body on the line, and every dollar you get really, really counts. So it wasn't transparency on decision making. I think that was the first thing. So I really kind of tackled that head on, was to say, look, coaches don't pick the team. Actually, I said the policy picks the team. So if we get our policy right, we can then make it easier. And then athletes will understand, why I'm in or why I'm out. And the same with the funding. If you do these things, this is the funding I can give you. If you don't do these things, I can't give it to you. And being open with them about what was actually available as well. So that kind of transparency, building that with the key people was the real Kickstarter, I guess. And then again, just what actually makes you good at what you do. Like they had phenomenal athletes, one of the best programs in the world when I went in. So there was a lot that was right. There was a lot that was good. It wasn't completely, falling apart, but people weren't really working together. And you can't get better in wrestling without partners. So there's no point, being in a gym, being as strong as you like. If you've got nobody to wrestle with, you just won't get better. So you need collaboration. It's part of becoming a better wrestler. So it needs to be kind of built into your way of doing things. So whether you're wrestling in Canada or Russia or wherever, you need to be able to go in and find people that can collaborate with you and work with you and make you better by challenging you and holding you accountable. The other part of that, Liam, I'd say, is probably the accountability piece. Accountability had kind of been let slide, and I talked about this mentality. Wasn't openly expressed, but essentially, I'll do just enough so I can make the team and get my funding, but wasn't really thinking beyond that. And people weren't being challenged on that to say, actually, that's not where we want to be. We want to be up here. And right now we're just hitting a starting point, if you like, because getting on a national team is the first step. It's not the last step.
So it sounds to me like the invisible glue was that you had remarkable athletes, and where it started to break down was a lack of communication, which then led to a lack of trust, which led to a complete breakdown. And then you came in, observed the system, and then implemented probably small changes, small fixed points or big changes to change the system.
Yeah, and look, Canada's a big country as well, so the system is pretty dispersed as well. And there's, they're well resourced, but at the same time, if I'm a coach and I need more money to take my athlete to a training camp to get them better, but that money's being spent on a dietitian, people go, well, why is that happening? What's the rationale behind that? And nobody was really explaining the rationale. They're just saying, oh, it is what it is, and people go, well, how come that person's getting this? And it starts to become a bit, cross wires. People are not really clear. So it was communicating across the system, I think, so going out, visiting, getting there. But then when we got together, actually communicating internally in the group as well. So, and also setting a pretty clear stall of like what was acceptable and what wasn't, and there was some pain, I can tell you, for some of that. A lot of the stuff that we did, like around changing policies, would be things like, you're getting somebody on an athletes committee to vote for a policy that will effectively end their career because they're saying, we think that the age profile for athletes in this weight class, in this discipline is this. And if I'm an athlete rep sitting on there and I'm like, well, hang on a second, that's my weight class. It's like getting turkeys to vote for Christmas. So it was a bit, there was some challenging things there, but like getting a higher thinking, a higher rationale of being the best team we could be. I think that was kind of what we pushed for. And not everybody came on the journey. Like that was part of it as well, was giving people the opportunity, But if they didn't want to join you, said, that's okay. You just won't be on the journey with us. And so there's a couple of hard conversations along the way to say, a couple of coaches that just couldn't, didn't agree or didn't want to get on board or didn't want to be part of it. And, essentially went and said, you won't be part of the program and this is why. And then very quickly, what do you need for your athlete that's going to be in our program? How can we get the best for them? So still working together, but being really clear on if you can't be a team player, you won't be in our team. So you got to set that out early and be clear and follow up on it as well. Because if you threaten people with, I'm going to do something if you don't do this, and then you don't do it, pretty quickly they find you out and they'll keep pushing back. So yeah, that was part of the challenge. I think just getting that accountability as well as building the trust through some results.
I'm curious there. Once you observed and decided what your plan of action was going to be, strategically, did you go for a lot of the big items in one go, or did you knock them off one by one? How did you approach that?
I think the other thing is, like in every sports system or in every team, you're going to have a hierarchy, right? You're going to have your stars, you're going to have your kind of others that are making up the team that make the team good. We had a couple of really top athletes. So I said, okay, I need to make sure these ones are looked after because they've got biggest influence, strongest voice. So they're in contact with the whole system. So looking after those ones to make sure they have what they need to continue to be those elite performers. That was one thing that I kind of narrowed down pretty quickly. Working with their coaches as well. We had some amazing coaches. I think that's the other part that were just frustrated. So working with them and saying, hey, I know you guys are doing a good job. I know things are tough. What do you need to make what's the thing that's going to make it easier? Wrestling coaches hate meetings. They hate admin. They hate planning. And I said, look, let me take the bulk of that, but I still got to communicate with you. So I won't make you write a big document, but I'll write the document, but you need to tell me what you want in there. So when it came to training plans, things like that. So those were the easy ones for me. I could take that off because I had the skill set. The other thing was with the bigger kind of policy items that we wanted to shift, major changes in the system, we had to get a lot of buy-in. So there was a lot of kind of involving people in the process. An athlete selection one, a great example was actually getting the athletes involved in what would happen if you got injured at this stage in the selection process, and then kind of scratching their head and going, I've never had to think about this. I said, well, it could be you. What do you think should happen? And they said, well, I think I should be given a second chance. I'm the best wrestler there is. And I'm like, okay, but what about this guy who's been training for 4 years? Oh, yeah. So it's interesting. I looked on at the Olympics at the moment, and part of me was thinking, I wonder what their policy was like. And I wonder what the number 2 behind Lindsey Vonn was thinking, because there's an athlete that's bigger than the sport, a legend. And I don't know how many of you, like in your career, if you said, I've torn my ACL, I'm still going to play anyway. I feel like somebody somewhere should have said, hey, that's probably not a great idea for you long term. And also, we've got somebody else ready. But the language I thought of was competition ready. How could Lindsey Vonn demonstrate that she's competition ready? And that's something that I've put in all my selection policies. So it's one thing to be selected. The other one is like, once I get selected, what do I do? Am I continuing to prepare and be competition ready? And that was the accountability thing that I talked about. So it wasn't, I've set my place, in 3 months' time, I'm going to the World Championships. I can sit back and relax. No. Now the real work is going to start and we're going to go through it. So subtleties of language and policy can be your friend, but explaining at a human level, that's kind of the key thing as well. Not just, we did the document, there it is, read it and come to us, but they were involved in the development of the document. And then they felt like it was theirs and they could understand it.
You've talked publicly about Wrestling Canada moving from a culture of fear and compliance to one of respect and resilience. That's a big statement. What were the specific behaviors you saw inside the program that told you the culture was operating on fear, not just the words people use, but the things people were actually doing or avoiding?
Yeah, I think the key thing was probably part of it is kind of interpersonal fear, in terms of like, how's this person going to react to me? I think the other part of that is probably around what would the consequence be for me in my career if I do this thing. So if I try and hold another coach accountable to a standard, and I'm from one club and they're from another club, how might that play out in the national system? Am I suddenly not going to have a seat at the table? Am I not going to have influence in the room? Am I not going to get invited to that camp where they make big decisions? So it was a real and genuine fear, because if you speak up, it would affect your overall performance and your pathway to the things that they were working towards. So that would be kind of what I observed in terms of the fear. And it was just the inability to say the thing in the meeting when we're together. So probably in the first year, I experienced lots of meetings after the meeting. And as somebody who hates meetings, I was like, I'd sit in a meeting for an hour and the meeting would finish. Everybody go, yeah, that's great. That's what we're doing. You look a bit on being an hour. Who decided that? But sometimes you just need more time, right? So you got to be able to say, this is a big topic. It's going to take what it takes. And when it's done, it's done. So I would make people do more than an hour. I would do like, maybe it's 2 hours because we want to talk about selection for the Olympics. And then we go from there. So yeah, that was part of the shift. And then it became, it just couldn't always get the desirable outcome that we wanted. But sometimes we had to just accept it and say, right, what are we going to do with this? We tried to move it to a place where it would be disagree and commit. So not, agree to disagree and you walk out of the room with a chip on your shoulder, but actually disagree and commit and at least, give a person an opportunity to kind of express what they're unhappy about without it being, whining or going on, but actually deal with it in the moment and say that is a valid concern. How do we make sure we don't find ourselves in a situation like this again if I can't do anything about it now? And also, are you just thinking with your, your hat on for your club? Or are you thinking bigger picture and challenge them on that? And quite often when you would challenge that, they would say, actually, this is the better thing for the program. I was lucky in the fact that I was a neutral. I didn't belong to any club. I wasn't, I didn't have any kind of personal politics or skin in the game other than Canada being the best they could be. And when they saw that, people could kind of follow that and go for it. So, because that was what they always wanted. But I think just got a little bit sidetracked.
It makes sense.
So what, obviously you're going to talk about psychological safety, and you're touching upon it now. So when you have these open and candid meetings, would people ever absolutely unleash on you? And how would you deal with that? Because you're encouraging openness. So
Yeah.
if someone's like really annoyed, they'd say, "No, I'm fed up with this." How
Yeah.
do you deal with that when it kind of oversteps the mark a little in terms of respect,
Well,
perhaps?
yeah. So I think I go back to values. So if anybody crosses a line like that, I talked about a coach, that I had to say, you're not going to be part of our group because he repeatedly would do that. So he would be disrespectful either to a staff member or myself or just be quite negative about the program. And we kind of said like, look, we're noticing this pattern of behavior. Get it all off your chest. But once that's done and I've done some stuff to help you with that, that's it. We're not going back
Yeah.
there. And then it came up again in a meeting and I just said, right, we stopped the meeting. It's not actually productive. Everybody left. And I said, right, you're out. And it was pretty much dealt with it. And you do have to be strong in some of those ones. I think the other thing I would say, what I learned is hopefully you don't get to that point, Liam. So hopefully you can have a meeting where you kind of know what's likely to come your way, but not too predictable. But I would hope to have my finger on the pulse enough to be able to know actually, I can sense that Justin's probably coming to this meeting a little bit unhappy. So I might actually acknowledge that because it gives you kind of all of your tells, all of your triggers that actually Justin's starting to get under my skin. Sorry, I keep using Justin as the example because Liam's smiling at me. But I would say this is what's getting under my skin. And I'd start to feel that behavior kind of come up in me. And I know that when I get reactive, I'm probably not going to be that productive either. So how do I kind of take the pressure out of that by saying, actually, I can sense this is happening. Let's maybe talk about it a bit more to understand it better. But I think you do have to have a hard line on values and kind of code of conduct. And again, policy is your friend with those things, but values equally, shared values where you say, if respect is one of our values, which it was in Western Canada, a really simple debrief I would do with coaches is if we go through the values at the end of a tournament, which one was dialed up the most and which one was dialed down the least? And how would you address that? So a coach in the corner screaming his head off at an athlete, like go, go, go. For me, I see a lot of passion there, but maybe respect depending on what they're shouting. We might say, right, we need to dial up respect. If we talk about excellence, which was one of the other values as well, we won a medal, but then one of our values is integrity. And like we would look at that and say, how did we win? The manner of the victory. So a really simple debrief can be done, through your values. And if you're talking about values regularly, it becomes a lot easier to actually, live them and embody them and make them part of what you do. If you never talk about them, they're just written on a wall, like it's just empty words. So I'm very big on living my values. I talk about them. I tell people they know who I am and what I do. And then I back it up with action, so I follow through. So rather than just saying, oh, those are nice to haves, they're must haves for me.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And moving on to I hope I do this next question justice. We're going to talk about psychological safety. And you said that you've mapped out a model that's got 4 distinct zones. Can you tell us about that?
So I can't take credit for the model. It's Amy Edmondson's model, so a Harvard professor. But essentially, it's very buzzy, right? Everybody's asking about it these days, and it's probably one of the most misunderstood or misused terms I've heard, because a lot of people come at it from a well-being lens. You know, it's mental health, it's well-being, it's all of those things, and those things might be byproducts of what you get. But psychological safety is actually about performance, and that's kind of where the space I play. You basically have 2 axes. You've got psych safety on the one side, and then you've got accountability on the other. And psych safety, one of the rugby players I work with, he paraphrased it beautifully for me. It's saying what you need to say, when you need to say it, who you need to say it to, and being welcomed for that. So not having it held against you. And I thought that's such a simple way to explain. There's lots of academic versions of that, but I really like that one, and I'm taking it for me. So thanks to that player, he knows who he is. But essentially with that, you know that in a group of 45 players in a rugby team, everybody's going to experience that differently. So if I tell Liam, you know, you're starting on Saturday, geez, Lúcás is a great guy. You know, I'm feeling really good. I might be up into a better space. I'd say, Justin, you're dropped because Liam's starting. Justin might be like, oh, I'm not happy about this, and I don't even know if I have a contract next year. What's coming up? So the reality of the kind of the 4 zones that we have is when you've got high psych safety and high accountability, you get into this great space called the learning zone or the performance zone, which rugby players I worked with just called the zone. And I'm like, that's fine. But the reality is you can't live in the zone all the time. It's high energy, it's high performance. You can't stay there. So there's other zones. So there's high accountability and low psych safety, and that's called anxiety zone. And the anxiety zone is basically, you know, I've played there before where you have a coach that's really overbearing, demanding of you, and you're almost playing out of fear, you know, so you're playing not to lose, not to win. You know, it's a very different space to find yourself in. Then on the other side, we've got, you know, low psych safety, low accountability. And one of my good friends says, this is working at the council. And I said, well, it could be, but it's like nobody's following through. Nobody really cares. There's lots of bureaucracy in held to account, and maybe you don't really care. So I hope my bins will be taken out in the morning for saying that. But, you know, there's that kind of low accountability and low care. Like, I'm not really bothered. And then the last one is the kind of the comfort zone. So it's high psych safety, low accountability. And like, I call that the happy losers. You know, like the environment's great, but we're not winning anything. But the reality is you'll move across all 4 zones in a day, in all of the time. It's how do I get most of my team into that space, that performance zone, as often as possible. So if I've got 45 rugby players and it's contract negotiation season, half of them are going to be sitting in a space where they're like, I'm not sure what's going to happen next year. And if the star player doesn't sign his behavior, so how do we know when it's end of year financials, quarterly results that we're looking for sales? How do people react in those moments? So you can get a picture of that, and how many people are in those zones, and how do I switch from one zone to the other?
It's really, really interesting. I've got a really important question on this. Signals. Do you see, you talked about like you're analysing it and seeing patterns. What are signals when someone's in say a high anxiety area versus someone that's basically a happy loser? What are the signals?
Yeah, so I think the high anxiety one is I look at the leaders and what the leaders are doing in an environment. So if you see a lot of closed questions, which we're really bad at in sport, I have to be honest, we say, are you good? And if the head coach says, are you good? And it's the day before a game, you say yes. Like you know, it doesn't matter what's going on. I pulled my hammy getting out of the shower. Doesn't matter. Yes. You know, there's only one answer to that question. So I look at how many closed questions are being asked and how they're being answered. I look at, is there things happening around the periphery of the meeting as well? Is there the meeting after the meeting before the meeting? Is that stuff happening? And then for the comfort zone or the kind of the happy losers, I just look at accountability and behaviors. So one sports academy I was in recently, they talked about, some of their values, it was respect and this kind of thing. And it was an AFL environment, and they came in and the players weren't even wearing anything on their feet. And I'm like, well, you don't even respect your moneymaker, your foot, your boot. And then somebody cut an old lady off in the parking lot to get that parking spot so that they weren't late for training. And I just happened to be waiting for the lift to go up into the building. So little things like that where I go, and then you go up and you talk to them and they're, oh, everything's fantastic. We've got everything. And I say, oh, just talk to me about respect. And then you see the behaviors aren't matching. The accountability isn't there. There's not an older player going, hey, do that around here. There's not an older player stepping in to go, hey, do you need to park? Why don't you take this spot and I'll go around the block again? Whatever it might be, those are the signals that you start to see. One of the other things as well is like really simple principle. I call it the ice cube principle. So it's check yourself before you wreck yourself. So before I start looking around to see who's in what zone, where am I? So I start like in an environment, if I'm part of a team, where am I? So if I find that actually I've got low accountability today, or this task isn't challenging for me, how can I be a better team player? How can I help somebody get into their learning zone? Because maybe this thing's easy for me, but it's hard for them. Or maybe I'm coming off the back of a really stressful period. And you know what? You need to rest. You need to be in that comfort zone because you need to come back down after. We can't keep you up there all the time. And then the other thing is just how are we checking in on each other as well? So what's going on around work without terms? They put a smiley face, a sad face, whatever. And literally before training, they walk in and they just mark with an X. Which one do you think you're in? And then me as a coach or as a leader, I can see the board and go, out of 20 people, 12 of them are saying they're in the learning zone. And there's a few honest ones here saying, I'm actually in the anxiety zone. Things aren't going great for me at school. I'm struggling today, whatever it might be. And somebody is going, I'm the best person on this team. This drill isn't even going to challenge me remotely. But they're aware of it. And they're kind of going, I really hate Mondays because it's all the easy stuff that I know already. And then when they've gotten comfortable with marking it, then you can start going to conversations about it. So whenever I do this stuff initially, it's always anonymous. We don't even look at the board. We just see the numbers. And then you move to a point where after a little bit of time doing this as a regular habit, you can say, how do we feel about actually talking about this? Does somebody want to share why they feel like they're in the learning zone or their anxiety zone or whatever? And you'd be you'd be surprised how people respond to that when they say, Liam says, I'm actually in the anxiety zone today. I'm really stressing out about this. And people will turn around and go, actually, I'm kind of stressed about that as well. But something that's helping me is this. How do I pull you up, into that space?
That's brilliant. I mean, I love it. It's effectively what you're doing is walking a room. Effectively, in business terms, you walk in a room. And there's a lot of trust that's needed on both sides to implement that system. So they've got to respect the coach before they start crossing off how they're feeling on board. But it's fascinating.
One of the things I picked up on working around the world and speaking a few languages was, if you've ever seen Russians speaking and you don't speak Russian, you probably think they want to kill each other or they're doing something crazy. And hey, sometimes they are, but other times we're actually pretty bad at reading facial signals. So there's a thing called the Kuleshov effect, comes from Soviet cinema, and they basically cut a picture and then to a scene of like an actor's face and then a scene. So it will be like, Justin's face and then a hamburger, and then Justin's face and a car, and then Justin's face and, a boxing ring. And actually Justin's face is the same all the time, but the way people's context, they went, oh, he must be hungry, or he must want to fight, or he must want to go for it. We're terrible at reading faces. We think we're good. There's so many courses on NLP, body language, everything. And I'm like, what I've learned from working around the world is we're actually really bad at it. So we need deliberate things to check in because we think we're good. And actually really well-intentioned leaders say, Liam, how are you going? In front of everybody, and Liam's an introvert and he doesn't want to answer the question, but the boss has asked him, so he goes, yeah, sweet, like whatever. So we need practices that kind of take that out of destigmatize it, make it really normal. Don't make it a compliance thing, but actually make it like really intentional. Yeah. Why are we doing this? Because we actually want to have a good meeting. And if I saw that I was starting a rugby session or a meeting or whatever it was, and 20 people tell me they're in a mixture of the anxiety zone and the apathy zone, I said, if you just kick this meeting to tomorrow, So I've done that as well. So like people see that you're actually responding to it. I did a session recently where I did a different check-in model using emotions, and one of the players put meh as their emotion. And I was so happy because I was like, I think you're being really honest. And I was like, I don't think you're trying to be, provocative. And she acknowledged it. She kind of said, hey, that was me. And I said, great, tell me why you feeling meh. So we just did a Bronco. And we did like fitness after that. And so we're absolutely smashed. The last thing we want to be doing is sitting in a room, listening to some Irish fella ramble on about this. So I was like, great, let's get up and move. Let's do something. So it helped me do a good job for them by checking in with them. And then the other thing you can do is you can model as well. You can take part in it and say, this is how I'm showing up today. I've been in so many workshops as well where people show up and say, how are you arriving today? And it's a big people are on their phones all the time. Drop a word in that and then it pops up and we're like, great.
Anyway,
it didn't happen.
Those days.
Moving on. So we know what the RON zones looks like. Can we delve into a little bit deeper now? Yeah. At Wrestling Canada, you brought external partners and redesigned a whole behavioral framework. Use specific tools, a leader's toolkit, a WEI model. That sounds deliberate rather than accidental. Walk us through what a leader in one of your environment was actually asked to do differently on a Tuesday morning, not the theory, the practice, or what changed in how people spoke and how decisions got made, how feedback moved through the room, and how long did it take before the system started to shift for you?
Yeah, so I think I gave one away just in the last piece there around the check-in, but also the check-out. So check-out system as well at the end of the day. So not just how we're arriving, but how we're leaving. Because what's interesting to notice is if you arrived in the anxiety zone and we worked with you during the day, are we sending you off in a learning zone? Or are you still there? And then I know I got to check in on you tomorrow as well. So we became better at that. One of the big shifts I saw around the emotional intelligence work was coaches knowing their patterns a bit better, knowing what kind of push their buttons and being a bit more aware of that, and then kind of catching it in the moment and going, hey, you know what? I'm pretty sure my button's being pushed right now. So I'm just going to take a breath, reassess the situation. And one of the big ones was a really simple thing, was a coach going, let's not talk about Liam while he's not here. Really simple thing. If we've got something to say to Liam, let's get him back here and talk to him. Really simple, but the kind of to catch yourself in that moment and go, I'm going down a route here where it's either going to be gossip or something negative or whatever, and them actually checking themselves before they wreck themselves and going, hey, let's just get Liam back and say, hey, Liam, there's something I need to let you know. This is what I think about. So that's how it would be different. It'd be checking in, it'd be knowing your pattern. With the intimacy director, which was a really fascinating learning for me, and I've continued to use people like that since then. So there was a kind of a safe sport report. And one of the recommendations came in was around physical contact and recommending there shouldn't be physical contact between athletes and coaches, which is pretty problematic if you're wrestling. You can imagine trying to coach rugby without being able to touch your players. So the key thing was we reframed that as a possibility around positive touch. So we looked at there shouldn't be inappropriate contact, and we all agree on that, but there should be specific, technical stuff that we need to do our jobs. And, people are being held to account for the mistakes of somebody else over here now impacting our program. So was compliance kind of gone bonkers? So we framed it as actually, no, we're going to go down the route of positive touch. And an intimacy coordinator, basically what their job is, and my friends who are intimacy coordinators are going to kill me for this, but simply they are the negotiator between the actors and the director. And they decide kind of what will be agreed upon, and then they keep everybody accountable. It might be we're filming a love scene. Justin, the script says that you're going to be topless in this scene, and you say, I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that. I can do that. This is what it's going to look like. And here's all the safeguarding we put around it to make sure it's good. The next thing, the camera's rolling and the director says, you know what, Justin, this would look better if you took your pants off. And you're under pressure and everybody's there. And you kind of go, well, hang on, I didn't agree to this. What's going to happen, right? So it's all around agreement and managing contracts and agreement and getting those things. So what does that look like in a wrestling environment? Obviously, we're not getting naked and doing all those kinds of things. But it was actually about getting permission to push for performance, because there's things that we have to do as high performance athletes where you have to get uncomfortable. You have to session today in it out in terms of this is what we're getting. And what the intimacy coordinator got us to really get good at was getting that agreement, getting that acknowledgement, getting that consent, and then going for it. And one of the biggest shifts I saw was in an athlete and coach who worked together for a long time. And this athlete was like a happy-go-lucky, smiley female wrestler, like the absolute antithesis of wrestling, like just sunshine and rainbows. And her coach was a hard-nosed, old-school coach who's just like, stop putting me on your Instagram. Water, which was go get yourself together and come back when you're ready to do it, because she didn't want to be called out in front of all the athletes because it looks bad, and but at the same time she wanted to be held accountable without it feeling like a threatening way. And the other thing that she could do is, if he was kind of riding her too hard, being too tough on her, she could say, I think I need a drink of water, which is code for him to say, you need to back off here. You're just being cranky and you're not being helpful. And then they would kind of, have conversations around that. But the thing that they said was, we can't just stop in the middle of a wrestling practice and go, hey, tell me about your feelings and why you're upset. Like, that's not reality. We need time for those conversations, because if those conversations matter, you give them the time they need. But in the meantime, we've got to deal with it. And that could be something as simple as a trigger of like, this is what it is. And so I've continued to use people like that, in all the work I've done with teams, intimacy coordinators. And that particular one was Siobhan Richardson. And she came in and she even looked at things like the positions we take up when we're coaching. A lot of coaching demos happen in the middle of the circle of wrestling, but you can't see anything as a coach. So it's like, doing a rugby drill and having your head in a scrum, trying to teach people how to scrummage. You can't see what's going on. So she just said, look, it's not good or bad. It's just not effective. You could be way more effective if you stood over here or if you dropped your position down here. So what I really liked was how we were able to reframe the language away from good and bad. It was about what's effective and what's helpful. Does this help you or not? The other thing they gave was really simple improv language, which you can try yourselves, which is a simple thing. Somebody gives you an idea, like a yes and improv. So yes, and what else could we do? So welcome the possibility, build on it. But if it was something you didn't agree with, you could give it a no, however. So you might say, hey, Justin, are you good doing 6 rounds of, live drilling now? You could say, yes, and I want to work on my, ground defense. Okay, great. Let me put that in the session for you. Whereas if you said, I've actually carried a knee injury, you might say, no. However, I'd be willing to do 3 rounds because I got modified training because of my knee. And so it's simple things. It sounds a bit cringy when you start this stuff first, but it becomes very natural and very normal pretty quickly. And I think that's the thing, is sticking with it, having those deliberate practices so they become part of your culture, they become heuristics, and they're driven by everybody in the environment. So people would then say, well, actually, or they kind of joke around, hey, Lúcás, you didn't get permission for that. Sorry, and we would kind of joke about it, but it was embedded at that stage. We could joke about it because we were at a point where we're actually like, this is just normal for us. And people would watch us, other teams would watch us and go, they're interested in how they operate. And it was just navigating those spaces.
That is fascinating. And you said there about it being or you taking it with you in different environments. Have you implemented that in a rugby environment, and how did that go? In terms of the intimacy coordinator?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So intimacy coordinator, not yet, but in the work I did with the Gen 32 coaches, we brought an intimacy coordinator there, and he was actually a pretty cool guy, Nigel Poulton, if you ever want to have a good chat. So former stuntman, looks like a bikie, big beard, drives on his motorbike, and just very simple. This is how you get consent and agreement with your athletes. But what I loved about Nigel was he explained to these young coaches about power dynamics, and people today, they're much more aware of things like consent and kind of pushing for performance and what the line is and what you can kind of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate anymore. But actually they were kind of feeling like their hands are tied, because they're like, I can't even raise my voice, like and they said, well, why do you need to raise your voice? Well, maybe you're not standing close enough to them. Maybe you haven't framed your session well enough. Maybe, so we start to get these things. So there's this kind of misconception that kids just aren't as tough today. They can't handle, what we throw at them. But I was like, their reality is very different. We have to have new tools to work with them. So even younger people in the office, I've had people say, I don't take meetings on Friday because that's my well-being day. And I'm like, right, okay. How do I approach this? Like somebody has it on their out of office and I'm like, okay, I got to do that, and that's interesting. So what do you do on your Friday, on your day off? Build a connection and do something else. So there's different ways to get there, but it's challenging us in terms of our skills to be more effective. And Nigel worked with a group of coaches from aerial skiing to surfing, like everything in between. And one of those coaches is now at the Winter Olympics, who came from like an entry level coach to now being at the Olympic Games. So really excited to see what they're doing in their environments. And part of that is it doesn't talk about, this is the session. It's like, this is your opportunity today. This is what you can do. And they kind of go, oh, okay, what are we doing? And it's like, you can show me what you can do here. And if you do this well, we're going to do a double backflip. Oh, great. Like, let's go, So sometimes we just need to be self-aware for ourselves and then go for it. There is one thing that's kind of rolling around my mind looking at three rugby men on the call. There's a great clip from the Springboks of Dan Newman. It's a hype video for the Springboks and it pains me to talk about it, but they are so good at what they do. And you probably wouldn't think of the Springboks as being a kind of warm, fuzzy environment or anything like that. But the human factor is so strong in their culture, how they look after their people. It's very internal. It's us against everybody, but when you're in there. But there's a great clip with Dan Newman talking about it's only a risk if you haven't done the work. And I think that's so good for high performance environments. So before you start going, hey, Justin hasn't done this or whatever, have I done the work? Like, have I done my role? Have I done it as effectively as I can? Okay, if I have, now I can go and say, hey, Justin, I need to just let you know you haven't done a great job there. How can I help you be better in that space? I think it was such a great line by Dan Newman in terms of how he talked about it. And maybe that's why our scrum got demolished back in the autumn by the Springboks. Maybe not, but it's a real insight to that edge between just being nice and being soft, which is not what psych safety is. It's got a hard edge to it, which is I can't hold you to account because I care about you. But I am going to hold you to account, and it's not being that nicey nice. I'll just tell Justin what he wants to hear because he's my mate and I don't want to upset him. It's actually, no, Justin's my mate. I really care about him. If I don't tell him he's in the comfort zone, he's going to get stuck there, and it's going to cost us in a big game. How do I get him in there?
Yeah, it's fascinating. You got me in a high anxiety state though, actually, because you talk about Fitzy's love scene.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
We're navigating.
So if I butcher the next question, then I'm sorry about that. I'll try and get myself in the right zone. But let's talk about the work you're doing at United World Wrestling. You built a global talent ID program from scratch. 114 athletes, multiple countries, a 50% Olympic qualification rate. In terms of systems, is there anything that, because you're working across multiple countries, is there anything that you thought was right on paper but didn't survive reality?
Yeah, it's really funny because I actually think of that example a lot when I work with corporates. So an international federation, if you've read about FIFA and seen things in the news, a lot of those things are pretty endemic in international federations. All the politics, the voting, everything that kind of goes on in the background. But there's a lot of good things happening as well. So you're constantly trying to hold back the tension of, people with nefarious motives that are just trying to get what they want versus kind of the greater good of sport and what it can do. So it's a real tricky balance to navigate. The system that we set up, the first thing I noticed was we didn't actually have experts in our system, doing the talent detection. So like my background's rugby. I'm not a wrestling expert per se. So when I came in, I kind of said, well, how many wrestlers work here? And they were like, oh, not a whole lot. And I just went, well, surely we need wrestlers that tell us what good wrestling looks like. So I got permission to kind of build a team of ex-wrestlers or ex-athletes that could kind of help me detect the talent. And so that was the first thing. And I'm surprised how often we have people in positions that don't have the expertise that we're actually looking for. So if we're saying We want that person to be a manager, but they've got no managerial experience. But we put them in there because they were good at something else. It happens quite a lot. So making sure you've got kind of aces in their places, I think, is a key thing that really worked well in that system. So for Africa, I had a guy from Ivory Coast, Vincent Aka, and his job was, I need you to find me talent in Africa that can be competitive at the games. I don't want people just to go to the games. I want to see medals at the games. And so he was very, on the ground, doing talent ID, and then kind of saying, these are the best wrestlers. And you get a list, and then a continental president or president of a country would go, well, geez, my nephew's a pretty good wrestler. And I'd go, oh, is he now? And he'd say, oh, yeah, he's very good. Like, I think he could go to the Olympics. And I'm like, that's interesting because he hasn't wrestled at any competitions that I've seen. So it was like, you would have to constantly come back with like hard data to back up your position. So it's hard data, expertise, and then build a relationship. So if that guy's going to be a roadblock, I need to build a relationship with him and go, right, I know you're really interested in your son or your nephew or whoever it is. That's not going to happen. He's not going to the Olympics because it'll look bad for you and you don't want to look bad. So understanding kind of like local politics as well as the global politics, but saying, but what are you interested in? Hey, what if you hosted the training camp for all these athletes? Hey, that'd be great. And, you can cut the ribbon. Fantastic. That's all I want to do. So it was understanding, not being politically naive to what the big bad world was, but at the same time pushing up against it with enough data and evidence to say, we'll do a good job. The other thing was what they've been notoriously bad at. So a lot of this funding came from the Olympic movement, and what they've been really bad at was reporting. So giving them good reports, giving, the system what they wanted, said, oh, those guys are doing a good job. Let's give them more funding, more support. It also came at a time where wrestling had been kicked off the Olympic program and then just recently brought back in. So when I came in, the president, the Serbian guy, fantastic guy, he basically said, look, we made all these promises to get back on the program. You need to bring this to life. So we've said we'll have more women wrestling. You need to find more female wrestlers. You need to support more female coaches. You need to support more developing countries. So I had a really strong mandate from the top, which allowed me then, if I did butt into somebody, like kind of go, hey, this guy's giving me grief. Can you deal with him? Or he'd call the guy and just say, whatever Lúcás has said, that's what's happening. And hang up on the phone. You used to hang up a phone like that back in the day. So it was the mandate, but then also like the expertise that we brought in. The other thing was knowing actually what good looks like in terms of wrestling, in terms of what it takes to be really competitive. So we've all seen those Olympic stories of people going to the Olympics and it's the first time they're in a swimming pool, or, they've never run that distance or whatever, but they got in because they got a wild card. Or what we didn't want was those types of athletes. We didn't want the tourists. We wanted people that deserved to be there, that with a little bit of help could really make the leap. One of the people who's had the biggest impact on me in my career is a female wrestler called Isabelle Sambou, who's from Senegal. She comes from a small town, but traditional wrestling is part of their culture. Everything is in there. They put curses on you, black magic, voodoo, all sorts of stuff going on, but wrestling is the core. And I went and saw her in her village where she's from, and she talked about, like, if you fight with a girl from another village and she takes your boyfriend, you wrestle her and the winner gets the boyfriend. And I'm like, wow, like this is amazing. If somebody stole your goat, we sorted out in the wrestling. So it was this real embedded part of her culture. But this is a person who, I gave her contract. We discovered she couldn't write. And so the really confronting thing that I'm like, you're probably going to the Olympics, but you can't write your signature. And so one of the big things we did was we looked after the person as much as the athlete. So we contacted the Alliance Française, we contacted the embassy. We've got this fantastic female leader. She needs help. Can you guys help her? And the next time I saw her, we went surfing in Senegal. I took her for a surf, and she is signing the insurance waiver that you have to sign when you take a surf lesson. And I was like, my mind was blown. I'm like, amazing. She's signing the thing. And then she said, by the way, I can't swim. I said, let's go to the water. So it's just the people you meet, the connections you make, but it's also looking after the whole person. And I think as athletes, we often get the athletic part right. This is what's going to make them stronger or better at what they do. But I'm actually making, their life better, and it's a kind of altruistic thing to be able to do it, to be in a privileged position, to be able to help somebody like that. But she's really helping herself and just kind of putting that thing. So that makes your program so much stronger. People are so much more invested when they know you care about them. And she's constantly in my mind when I think of things of how sport can change someone's life. It's phenomenal.
What a fantastic story. So you led Wrestling Canada through COVID, difficult times, competitions cancelled, training environments disrupted, athletes isolated, and a Tokyo Olympic cycle that kept shifting under everyone's feet. During that period, what was part of the system? What part of the system held, and what part quietly fell apart that you didn't expect?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting time. It's such a unique scenario that we experience in sport. You know, you've been getting ready for something for 4 years, and all of a sudden it's been, you don't even know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen, you know, the uncertainty around it. And it just played havoc with people's mental health, I would say, like just in general. Like it was really, really difficult for people. So we tried all the adaptive things we could in the beginning. Do we need to move somewhere else to train so we can all be together? Which border is open? Where can we go? But at the end of the day, what I saw, which I thought was interesting, was at a certain point, the uncertainty just got too much and we lost our connection, because as much as we can be good online, nothing beats getting in a room together and connecting. And the willingness of people to travel somewhere else and be away from their family and their homes when things were so uncertain, it just dwindled. It just got worn away over time. So people became more risk averse. And that was probably the thing that was a bit of the undoing at the end, really, was that risk averse tendency just came through a bit stronger. And it was, people were still working hard, but they were working more in isolation. And a lot of it was circumstances that we couldn't control. And I think now when you look back on COVID, there's so many things that you think, oh, I would have done this differently or that differently, but nobody had ever been prepared for something like this. And at a certain point, there were things that you just couldn't force as well, you know? So I had a whole strategy mapped out about the places that were still open. So at that time, Iceland, I think, had like a 3-day quarantine when you got into Iceland. They have one of the biggest MMA gyms in Europe. And I said, you know what? We could probably, with support of the Olympic Committee, Own the Podium, all our partners, we could probably get the whole team to Iceland and train, you know, as a group there. But then people were saying, well, my granny's not well. I'm worried about her. You know, my partner's not well. I don't know if I have a job. You know, all of these things started to kind of erode. So the willingness to take a risk. And then it was, how long are we going for? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 2 months? Is it a year? Like, what if we go and we can't come back in? So all of those kind of things played on people's minds. And I think we did the best with what we had, but ultimately it was a very different experience than what we'd been planning and prepping for. So it probably don't have a great solution there. I can say, hey, this worked really well. I think at a certain point you kind of say, well, what's more important here, people's health and livelihoods or sport? And I think at a certain point, some people said, I choose the other stuff and I'll try and come back to sport later, or I'll go for sport. It did do random stuff as well. Like every selection policy I ever wrote didn't have a COVID byline in it. So we actually had an athlete who was injured, who wasn't going to make the Olympic team. And all of a sudden he was like, hey, we've got another 12 months. I reckon I could be good to go by then. And so it opened up the door for that. And he came back in, and, you know, so really random things that you just never accounted for. And even that, when like selection policies got challenged, I remember sitting in, because they love to do arbitration in Canada for selection, and sitting in an arbitration and the judge just going, I don't know what else you guys could do here. He's like, we've never experienced this. You've done everything by your policy, but we just have this force majeure that's now the door is open. So he said, do you want to rewrite your policy? You know, do you want to change something? And I said, well, actually we want them to sort it out on the mat. So let them wrestle each other. So I think it just made everybody think about what was important to them. And that's kind of where maybe a personal focus became the bigger thing. And that was what unraveled, I would say. So yeah, it was challenging at the end. And I felt so disappointed for athletes, you know, that this was the big thing that they'd been hoping for. And Tokyo, just to give you an idea, Japan are the #1 nation in women's wrestling, and they're very strong in the other disciplines. So that would have been a full house every day. It would have been an absolute amazing atmosphere to compete in, but they didn't get that experience, unfortunately. So I was happy some of them continued to Paris, but some of them didn't make it that far. They just couldn't wait.
I felt bad for Tokyo as well, really.
Yeah.
You know, invested all that money.
Yeah, and we'd done so many great things like in Japan in the build up. Like we had a training camp in one of the prefectures, and Japanese are just such great hosts. I mean, they're meeting you everywhere with Canadian flags and waving you in and making you welcome, and they absolutely loved our team. And our head coach had a long-standing rivalry with one of their athletes, so every media and press conference was about, yeah, it's great, the Olympics. What about that match that you lost against the Japanese wrestler back in 2002? They just wanted to replay everything. But they were amazing hosts, and we loved going there. And I'm hoping they'll get to host again sometime in the future because they do an amazing job.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, moving on to communication. Well, we talked about communication a lot, but has there ever been, you've walked across all different cultures, has there ever been a moment where what you're communicating in your mind is crystal clear, but on the other side it's not crystal clear? And what happens when in that scenario where you think you're being clear and the athlete doesn't understand what you're saying? And what does it cost if it breaks down communication?
Yeah, I think it's really hard when you're in high performance sport because there's kind of an expectation to do something when you come in, right? Like we brought you in, you got to do something right away. And a lot of the advice I had from mentors early in my career was, do nothing, just wait, have a look, observe. And I'm like, it's getting harder and harder to do that because if people are bringing you in from another country, they want to see it. What I try and do is look at what the communication norms are in an environment before I put my foot in it. And I have put my foot in it plenty of times as well. But actually the one that kind of stands out in my mind was being in a meeting in the IRFU, and I won't name names, but being in a meeting a long time ago. And so it was communicating in English. And I'm like, great meeting, think it's gone really well. And then leaving the meeting and going down in the elevator with one of the people that was in it and them giving me an absolute roasting. Like just came at me in a confined space in an elevator and me going, whoa, like I had no idea that was even coming. So it can happen in any culture is probably my point around that, is to say that if you don't check for understanding, if you don't get that checkout piece at the end to say, are we really aligned here in what we're doing? Then the risk you run is that we think we're on the same page, but we're not really. And then we go out, something happens. I've seen it like flare up on the field as well, where, you think you've sorted an issue, but you haven't really dealt with it. So it's just been performative communication. So, that great myth about communication is the illusion, or the illusion that it's actually happened. We said it, but it didn't really land. So the other one I would think of is probably with the athletes, is when you're being told either you're injured or you're not going, or like a big piece of information, the minute you hear I'm not playing, everything else you don't hear anything else. You're not playing because your tackling's not up to scratch. You need to work on this, and you got a shot next week if you work on it. You forget everything else after you're not playing. So I learned that the hard way, because a player who I really thought I could rely on, or an athlete I really thought I could rely on, I just said, look, you're not in this particular event because of these reasons. They went quiet. They took all the feedback. They said, yeah, okay, got it. And they went away and they didn't work on any of the stuff I asked them to work on. They didn't hear all the good things that I'd said about them. They only focused on the negative. And the result was they just got really disenchanted with the program and ultimately left the program. And a couple of years later, I met them and I was like, what happened? Like, you were so good. Like, we really can't, you guys just didn't rate me. We actually rated you really highly. And so it was a good reminder for me to, especially in those types of meetings, make sure, hey, play that back to me, Liam. What did you hear me say? I heard you say I'm not playing Saturday. Yeah, okay. What else? Oh, you said something about like my tackling. Oh, okay. Tell me. So what are we going to do about that? What's the plan we've got in place? So closing that loop is really, really important, but also understanding how stressful that environment is when you step into it. Like if I'd been in their shoes and I'm being told I'm not playing, probably I'm not going to hear anything. Like I've had the conversations with surgeons where they say, you're getting this surgery and you're going to be out for 6 months. And literally 2 seconds later, I said, well, what about the game on Saturday? And they're going, no, it's 6 months. Like you're going to be in bed. You won't be able to do it. Oh, okay. But maybe the week after, like, is it 2 weeks? Like, is there anything else you can do? And they're like, no. And it's just the nature of the beast. When we get bad news we kind of block everything else out. So we have to work really hard to bring them back in and say, play that back to me, and persist with it even when it's uncomfortable. Sometimes that's been when people are, crying or upset or emotional, and you just have to stick with it until you get there, so that you close that loop and you leave with, they mightn't like what you've told them, but they can understand it and respect it a lot better, and they'll heal a lot quicker from that.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Fascinating point.
So to build on that, I mean, you build a scholarship and qualification pathway for 114 athletes leading into Rio, which I take it that means that at some point you were telling some that they weren't going. When you made those calls, the ones that ended someone's Olympic cycle, can you expand on what that process looked like, and how did those conversations in the room go?
Yeah, so that one was a bit broader, because you'd be an athlete from a particular country and you'd have to meet all their qualification standards and criteria. So probably the harder conversations were happening there at that level. But what I did do, I talked about like checking in on the person and making sure that there was a plan in place for afterwards. I thought that was important. And then also having a bit of where are you going to be when you get the news is a really key thing. So how is that message being delivered? Ultimately, with wrestling, they usually find out on the map because it's a result. They didn't get the, so it's a little bit easier at times. But maybe a fresher example that would help that is artistic swimming. So artistic swimming is notorious for pushy parents and selection appeals every Olympic cycle in Australia. And so when I walked into that environment, I said, that's one of the things I think I'm good at. I did a diploma in sports law to get better at writing the policy. I'd learned the hard way from mistakes I'd made in the past. I said, I really want to get this right, because it's done poorly so many times. And I find it quite disrespectful to an athlete when you don't put the effort in to kind of do a good job. And I feel the same way with like job candidates or interviews and things like that. When you just get a generic email of you didn't get the role, it's not great communication. It doesn't reflect great on you as an organization. So with the artistic swimmers, what we did was I sat down with the coach first and said, what do you need to pick a good team? What are the things? What are your non-negotiables? You tell me. And she was Spanish, and she was very much like, I need technical, I need these standards, and you can measure all of this objectively. But said, but I need good people. I need people that are tough. I need people that are resilient. Said, I don't know how to measure that other than what I see in training every day. And she said, and I know you can't pick on, I think you're really tough, so we need some evidence around that. So she said, I need help to understand that. So we did a bit of work on that. And I said, what do you think is a balance between objective and subjective? So we ended up with objective was 70 and subjective was 30. And then we took this information to the athletes and we said, what do you guys think of this? Before we started the process, we said, you talk us through, what do you think are the key things here that we need? And they went through and they said, okay, we like the 70-30. We trust our coach. She's really good. She's won Olympic medals. We like that we can be objective, but the objective stuff that you're looking at, that's me as an individual with my legs upside down in the pool. And I might be the best at that, but that's not the competition. And so we want to be assessed more on what we do in competitions when we represent the team. We want to be assessed on what we do every day in training. And so one of the things we implemented around that was I got the athletes to present the policy to me. You explain the policy to me, because I don't want your mum or dad going, I don't understand this. I said, you need to be able to explain it to me. And then we published. And what we did was we had a soft selection after every tournament. So Liam, if we're picking the Olympic team today, great news, you're in. And this is why. Because you're doing all of these great things, but I just need you to keep an eye on this. Don't let this slack off. Or, Liam, if I'm picking the team today, sorry, you're not going to the Olympics. And that's because you've been late for training 3 times. Your nutrition's terrible. You didn't do this. You showed up late for the meeting. All this stuff. And I'd say, but you got a chance because you're really talented and you could shift this in the next few months. So no surprises was kind of our motto. So that when you get to sit down and have your final selection meeting, nobody should be going, I wasn't expecting that. They should know pretty much, I don't think there might be one surprise, but the majority of them came into that meeting knowing, okay, I'm ready for this. And a real hallmark of doing this job well was one of the athletes brought a bouquet of flowers for the head coach, knowing she wasn't being selected, to say, thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed training with you these last couple of years. Best of luck in Paris with you and the team. That's an incredible outcome for me in a selection policy.
Yeah.
And we had no appeals, 0 appeals. So I was very happy with that, because they're costly, timely, very negative. But that's kind of credit to the athletes and the coach really for doing that and kind of going, right, let's be involved in the process. Let's do it. And, and we were really accountable with them the whole way through. We would tell them, I need to have a difficult conversation with you now so it's not going to hurt you later. And then they go, oh, okay. And I'm like, your behavior is not good. Okay, what do I need to change? This, and this. And I'll be watching. And the good thing is, with most professional environments now, everything's filmed. So if somebody is not hitting the line on a Bronco test, you can see it. And then the next thing is, did anybody tell you? And I'd be more upset with the player who doesn't tell the other player than the player who doesn't hit the line, because the player who's looking at you and letting you get away with that, that's not the person I want. I want the person who goes, I might not be as fast as you, but you're not hitting the line and I'm working my butt off to be here. So you're going to hit the line as well. So it's those kind of things that reveal the character of the person. We had an athlete as well that picked up an injury at a major tournament. And she said, I want to compete. I want to nail my spot down. And the fact that she was so pushy, we were actually like, we like this. We like that her hamstring's hanging off her leg, but she wants to go. And we said, but you know what? You're not going to compete, but we really like this toughness in you. And if this was the Olympics, a bit like Lindsey Vonn, we'd be saying, are you competition ready tomorrow? What would be the long-term impact on your health? Would you recover? All that kind of stuff. But the display of behavior in that moment, we're like, that's the kind of person we want in our team, because he's going to push everybody else.
Yeah. Excellent. And we're just going to, one more question before we get into the quick fire, Fitzy. I just want to talk about your shift from running a high performance program where you own the results to working at the AIS, where your job is developing future leaders, basically. That's a different kind of pressure. What shift went on in your mindset? What do you have to unlearn? Where did you start with that change?
So I don't know how many coaching courses you've been on, but the big shift we try, this is the content, this is what and we're just going to transfer information from my brain to yours, was I hated those coaching courses. Most of the coaching courses I go on, the best thing is the coffee break, the beers afterwards, the dinner, whatever it is. That's when people are really connecting and learning and saying, hey, Fitzy, you were a front rower. Like, how do you approach the scrum? What do you do? It's those kind of spaces that we want. So I took a big approach on making it a social learning space and not just more technical content, because technical content is really easy to access now. I can go on YouTube, I can go on ChatGPT, I can get lots of good stuff pretty quickly. That stuff's not hard. It's the skills to actually build connection and relationship with your athletes. That was the big thing that I saw. And that kind of applies right across any walk of life that you're working in now, is relationships really matter. So what I did was I tried to build a program that really focused on giving them the skills to build really good relationships, understand the environment, understand how people learn, what that is. And we modeled that by producing that kind of environment so that they could experience it and then understand what it feels like and bring that back into their environment. So the big shift for me was really around keeping the temptation of people that were funding the program to kind of ram more content into the program and say, hey, that's nice, but actually, do you know what? Justin probably doesn't need a scrum clinic. He probably knows a lot about scrummaging already. So how could we use Justin to talk about scrummaging at that event so that we're going and see his environment and say, actually, I really love the way Justin explained that. His cueing was fantastic. What did you notice? I just loved how he gave that player a kick up the hole because that's what he needed because he wasn't pushing. It might be those things that we see, but it's changing the environment so that, we don't exist, separate from that. So the learning environment we set up is really key. So that was a big shift we made, and it was across. We had coaches from every sport, and I got to say, it's a pretty cruisy position sitting in the back, going, "Oh well, this is how I would do it." We tried not to be like that. We tried to learn from mistakes that we'd made, And we got a lot of top coaches who are willing to share their knowledge and come in, hey, this is how I screwed up at the Olympics on the biggest stage, and share their mistakes and their learning, rather than here's my hero story of how we won the gold medal. So we became experts in failure, if that makes sense. So learning from failure and understanding it, and how to kind of welcome that into our environment to make us perform better. So yeah, that was kind of the big shift. And it wasn't easy, because Australia love medals. They're medal hungry. So keeping that appropriate tension between, like, even how we assessed that course was, here's all the medals that Justin won, but here's his reflections on what he's learned as a person. And it was, I'm much more emotionally intelligent, or I communicate better, or whatever it is. But by the way, my team's doing really well. Because if we just had this kind of like nice things, Justin's a better person for being on our course, but he hasn't won anything, we would not get any funding for that course to go again. And it might be something that Justin would like to do on his own. So I had to make sure that we kept the balance of results. And I say I was lucky because we had an amazing bunch of coaches that have just won medals, been on teams, coaching at the Olympics now. But that program expanded and has gone on its own journey of that now. So it went from a pilot program of 11 to now it's 50 plus coaches around the country, really well supported. And I think that's the challenge of modern coaching, is how do I balance all of that and still look after myself as well? Not easy. It's not easy. Yeah. And it's probably why I jumped back into a high performance role for the Olympics, because I got kind of itchy feet just looking at other people do it and say, I've got a lot of knowledge. I'd like to bring it back in and apply it again. So I had that option to go back, and now I'm back in the space where I'm cruising a little bit, helping other coaches improve their coaching without the pressure.
Excellent.
Well, let's crack on into the quick-fire questions. Don't overthink them. You walk into a new high-performance environment on day one. What's the first thing you look at before you speak to anyone?
Behavior. Just observe. I like to see how they're showing up. How they, those first few minutes before something starts, you start to get a bit of a read on how people are in the kind of more informal spaces. So is it, like, how professional are they and how they're showing up? What are they doing? Are they living the values that are written on the wall? That's kind of what I'm looking for. Is there a match or a disconnect? Really simple thing that I would look at. And typically I'd look at their strategy before I even go into the environment to say, what are they actually trying to do? So that'd be the day before. And then the day I'm in, I'll be looking behavior. How do they treat each other? How do they treat people in the building?
An athlete you believe in just bombed at the biggest competition of their life. What do you do in the first 60 seconds thereafter?
Well, I when you sent this to me, I said, after I pull my head out of my hands, because I'd be absolutely devastated for them. I think the first thing would be like, go and support them, so it'd be a case of, being there and being that arm around the shoulder rather than a kick up the backside. They know they haven't performed. They don't need you to tell them. And I'd probably ask them what they need in that moment, either from me or for themselves. Typically we have a strategy around that as well. The phone, talk to your mom. She's waiting to chat to you. Yeah, something like that. But it'd be support in the first instance.
Worst decision you've ever made as a leader, and the one that still sits with you?
It's quick fire, so I'm just going to say trusting the wrong person. Having somebody keep a seat warm for me and then not getting out of the seat when it was time to get back in. That's probably the quick fire version.
Cryptic.
They know, I'm sure.
Just leave it at they know.
You've used Lego serious play with elite coaches. What's the most uncomfortable truth someone built with blocks that they couldn't have said out loud?
Oh, wow. I think probably and it's amazing what comes out in those sessions. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but I was very skeptical because of the types of environments I work in. But it actually allows people to access a different part and speak quite openly, and they surprise themselves. So the surprise that a person gave themselves was they had built a little tower and they'd put some skulls inside it, like the skull Lego men inside, and they were just chatting around, this is who I am and this is what I coach, and then somebody just asked, innocently, what's inside the tower? And they said, oh, it's a skull. And they said, oh, what does that represent? And they said, that's my athletic identity. I never quite made it as an athlete. And the tears came because they kind of realized that a lot of their coaching was unfinished business, and pretty emotional space to be in. But it was a very supportive room, good space to be in. But I mean, if you'd asked them, how much of your coaching is unfinished business as an athlete, no, none of it. I'm just here to coach. I'm here for the athletes. But it was an admission of actually this is part of me and it sits in here, and maybe I'm driving my athletes a bit too hard because of it.
Interesting. Okay. You've worked in rugby, wrestling, swimming, and now with across multiple performance domains. What sport had the most honest culture, and which one lied to itself the most?
Yeah, I would probably say the artistic swimmers. If I'm being, artistic swimming as a team. The Australian team. Now, these are 18 to 21-year-old women, young women, a Spanish coach, a Japanese assistant, and an Irish guy running the team. And I found that because the nature of the feedback they get is really corrections heavy, it's brutal. Like, I don't think rugby players will be able to handle it, because every time you pop up, it's wrong, 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 put your foot here, do this. It's a lot of critical feedback. So their culture was very honest at taking that feedback. But it's also a group of girls that are trying to get on with each other, living together, and so they had to have some pretty difficult conversations around, just being housemates, living together, being teammates, and then how that might transfer to the pool. I found them incredible to work with, like in terms of that leaning in. And it wasn't always good, like sometimes that brutal honesty can really hurt you because it's brutal, but they were very good at like rebounding from it as well, and kind of going, hey, geez, that was a bit much. We need to dial that down. How do we do that better next time? So it was kind of the leap forward they always made. How do we do that better next time? The next rep's going to be better than the last one. They were very committed to that. I see a lot of people saying that, but not doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been fascinating conversation, because you've given us an insight into high performance when things are under pressure. And there's so much learnings we can take from today's podcast. I mean, I've been enthralled listening to you. So, we thank you for your time today. We really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you very much, Lúcás.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It was really insightful. Thank you.